So, welcome everybody to today's edition of CESI Talks. CESI Talks is part of our series WE, which aims at bringing closer the policies of the European Union to our members. And today with us is Fabian Zuleg. Fabian Zuleg is Chief Executive of the European Policy Center. I would say the most important, at least from our perspective, think tank here in Brussels. Fabian, welcome.
Thank you.
Fabian, if you were to deliver today or tomorrow the State of the Union speech, what would you say?
Well, I think there's a difference, I would say, between the state of the world and the State of the Union. Clearly, when we look at the state of the world, we are still in the middle of a pandemic. We still have to address the health impact of the pandemic. Yes, we are seeing some progress, in particular when it comes to vaccination, but it is far from over, and there is a global dimension to this, where we also have to see that we make progress at the international level, because we know that the virus can mutate, that we can get into a situation where the vaccinations will no longer be effective. So there is a real need to address this problem across the world. When it comes to the European Union, yes, we are still fighting the pandemic, but I think we are also now seeing that on the one hand, the economic impact of the pandemic and what this is doing across the European Union with a very important differentiated impact. So it might be the same health crisis, but it is not having the same economic impact across the Union. And at the same time, positively, that we have taken certain actions at the European level. And in particular, the Recovery and the Resilience Fund, which is now finally in place. We just had the own resources decision ratified in all member states, which was the barrier which we had to take before we can implement it. So there is some progress, but this will be a long haul. There's a lot which will need to be done, and I think the transformations we're going through, both in terms of the desired transformations, the transformation towards greater sustainability, the transformation towards adaptation of new technologies, digitalization, but also the structural transformation which will come with the aftermath of COVID, will mean that we will have big challenges to deal with in the coming years.
So I read also between the lines, according to what you said, that if you would assess the overall response of the EU to Corona as not the worst.
No, I think certainly mistakes were made, and in particular when it comes to some of the policies which were put in place in terms of vaccination and in particular production capacity. It could have been done differently, but we should also not forget that this is an unprecedented situation. We had to react very quickly. We had to react in an area where the competences of the European Union were not particularly strong. And we had to always bear in mind that what is the alternative? What could we have done on a country-by-country level? And there, I think it is worth emphasizing that the European Union has to act in the interest of all the countries involved, and that also includes those countries which would have very much struggled to secure any vaccines on the open market, given their size, given that they don't have production facilities. So we have done things at the European level together, and in particular, we have recognized that the economic impact of Corona has to be something which has to be tackled together. And I think we should not underestimate how big a step it was to put the Recovery and Resilience Facility in place. This is something where we did have a very different discussion than we had, for example, during the Euro crisis. We really had a discussion which recognized that this is a common challenge we are facing and that we will have to have a common response.
I remember, Mr. Zulek, that a year ago your predictions were extremely, how could I say, extremely dire as to the economic and social impacts. Now you mentioned the recovery and resilience responses. Do you still see that way? Your predictions are still so dire, to put it that way, or are you much more positive than a year ago?
It's difficult for me to be more positive because we face a very uncertain situation, and there are many risks in the coming month, in the coming years. But I think what also these discussions serve to do is to put a warning out there. It's not necessarily to say that this will be the outcome, but it will be the outcome in the absence of effective policy intervention. And I think that's the important thing to emphasize, that policy matters. Policy will make a difference. If we hadn't acted, if we hadn't been able to get to the point of having a recovery and resilience facility, I think the situation would be much more serious than it is now. And I think we have to also keep a look on this in future, because many of the impacts of COVID on the economy have also been masked. Rightly so, governments have spent enormous amounts of money to keep activity in our economies going, to make sure that we don't have a social impact. That has deteriorated our fiscal positions all across the Union. It has deteriorated the capacity to do this in future. But I think it has worked. But we now need to see what happens, for example, once we stop the various job retention schemes, employment retention schemes. What happens once the direct support for companies is slowed down or starts stopping? That's when we really are going to see some of the longer term impacts, and we are also going to see that there's a big difference between what happens in some sectors, in some countries, in some regions. So it is far from over, and we will have to continue to keep a very good eye on it. And it might well be that in a year's time we say that the recovery and resilience facility was not enough, that we will have to do more, given where we are at that point.
One of the, you mentioned the effective policy interventions. One of the EPC is about to launch some rethinking the EU economic governance task force. And this task force is supposed to investigate possible reforms in 3 policy areas: the European Semester, Stability and Growth Pact, and social investment. Also, basically a discussion which has been led for many years. Can you be a little bit more specific on that? Are these effective policy interventions also beyond the facilities you mentioned, so the recovery and resilience facilities? Also something I remember also from many of your interventions that was the impression, a little bit apprehending the fact that after this period of spending, austerity will be back on the agenda, and that you or the EPC in general have been quite insisting on underlying that this should not happen.
Yeah, I think this is really the motivation behind the Economic Governance Task Force. We are seeing that these 3 topics you've mentioned, they are directly linked to the economic crisis coming with COVID and the aftermath of that. So now is a very good time to rethink what is it we actually want to do in these areas, what makes sense in the longer term. At the moment, when we look at fiscal policy, for example, the normal rules are effectively suspended. But does it make sense to go back to this set of rules once this immediate crisis has ended? Or do we need to think about some of the areas which have been in the discussion for a long time? So, for example, on the fiscal area, do we need some form of fiscal capacity at the European level, which is permanent, which is able to deal with the kind of crisis we are facing now? Do we need to establish more automatic stabilizers which can react in a crisis not only at national level but also at European level? How do we use the instruments which we've already built? Is the European semester effective in helping the countries to do the necessary reform which don't only address the immediate impact of the crisis but also the longer term effects, the longer term challenges which many countries are facing? And I think social investment is a very good part of that debate. We have had this debate for a long time, but we do also know that one of the big challenges of economic crisis and fiscal crisis is that investment, and in particular social investment, is often an area which suffers. It is one of the areas where it is not relatively easy when compared to other areas to cut, to suspend, to not do the kind of things which were on the political agenda before the crisis. But that has consequences. And I think we need to talk about what are these consequences and does it actually make sense? For example, we know from many studies that investment in areas such as labor market integration, training, does actually produce long-term positive returns. So if we stop those kind of investments in a crisis, we are actually in danger of prolonging the crisis rather than addressing.
In one of your papers, which was published here recently, also in cooperation with CESI, the authors, the researchers at the EPC analyzed the situation regarding public services and the capacity to perform for a fair and resilient society. Now, you mentioned effective policy interventions, and in the opening words, I think the authors say Europe needs a strong public service agenda. Is this something also you refer to the investment? I mean, you mentioned particularly social investment, but parts of it also, of course, concern the public services. Is that something where also the EPC will, how could I say, politically try to emit some policy pointers also in this direction?
I'm certain that when we have the debates, that public services will also feature, and I think it is clear that public services are a core part of the European economic and social model. So the question of what role public services should play and how they can also be strengthened within a crisis like this. How we can ensure, and this I think is a very big challenge, that they also function across the European Union, not just in some countries where there is a greater capacity, where also the fiscal means are there, but across the board, also in the countries which are more challenged by the current development. So I'm sure it will play a big part in that. But I think it is also important that public services are also challenged. This crisis, and that has been one of the things we have believed in from the beginning, is not a cyclical crisis. It is not a temporary crisis. It is a structural crisis. There are very long-standing changes which will result in our economies, in our societies. To put it very briefly, we will do things differently in future. And that will also mean that our public services will have to adapt. We will have to look at taxation systems. We will have to look at delivery. We will have to look at the healthcare sector, the care sector. So there will be many challenges, and change will be necessary to make sure that public services can also play the important and positive role in the aftermath of this immediate crisis.
Mr. Zuleg, Fabian, thank you very much for your time, for the interview. All the best to you, to the EPC, and above all, stay safe.